Welcome, everyone. We'll get started. Richard Brooke is here for our seminar on 6 things you didn't know about World War II, the war in the Pacific. So this is a different seminar from the one that he gave last year, which was about the European theater. Richard, we will be taking questions. We want you to type them into the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom of your screen of Zoom. And if you have any technical questions, please type those into the chat box. And our technical advisor will take care of your technical questions. So let's get started. Richard Brooke, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. And let me share my screen here and get started. Let's see if we can get this going. Okay, get this. I hope everyone can now see my screen. Can someone just let me know if the screen is being shared properly?
Looks good,
Perfectly.
Richard.
Perfect. Okay, good. So let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining the seminar today. As you know, I'm back again. And as you know, I really love writing these seminars and giving them. And your organization has been fantastic. The questions that we get are really fun. And I hope we enjoy this seminar as much as we have the ones in the past. So this seminar is a little different. We're going to cover the war in the Pacific this time. The first 3 seminars are going to cover the actual conduct of the war. Number 4 is going to be about some of the key people that were involved in the fighting. 5 is going to be a deep dive into the Battle of Okinawa. And number 6 is going to cover the period, including what I call the 12th hour of the 15th day of the 8th month, which is the day of the surrender, sort of bringing back the idea of the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day, sorry, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which is when World War I ended. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the ending of World War II was different than the ending of World War I. Let's jump into this first one right away. And I again want to thank you all for joining. The opportunity to talk with you all again is really a highlight. As many of you know, I've gone back to work full time, and yet I still really enjoy giving these seminars. It's really fun writing them, and even more interesting to give them, and I hope you enjoy it. So for some reason that I can't totally explain, the war in Europe seems to hold a more central place in American memory than the war in the Pacific. I think we'd all agree with that. But it's a bit strange that that's the case because of the roughly 400,000 Americans that were killed in World War II. About 215,000 of them, more than half, perished in the Pacific, while 185,000 perished in the fighting in Europe. Now, it could be that the reason for a more European focus is that most Americans actually came from Europe. That kind of makes some sense. I don't know. But with this series, I'm hoping that we can address this historic inequity and raise the level of understanding of the war in the Pacific. Somebody a lot smarter than me once noted that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. And with names like Tarawa and Kwajalein, Noumea, Tinian, and Saipan, the Pacific War became a huge geography lesson for Americans that was played out over 15 time zones. The vast Pacific Ocean was the arena for what became a giant death match between Japan and the United States, an area that measures 6 times the distance from New York to Los Angeles. That's the distance from Los Angeles to Tokyo. And we're darn lucky that the Pacific Ocean was really as vast as it is, because when the war started, we were in such a bad way that that distance is probably the only thing that kept the Japanese from launching an invasion of our west coast that quite possibly could have penetrated all the way to the Pacific, to the Mississippi River. Now, when you think of the war in the Pacific, I want you to think about this movie that I'm sure everybody's seen, The Bridge on the River Kwai. Never mind that it was actually a fictional portrayal of what actually happened. The bridge built by the prisoners did actually not cross the River Kwai. In fact, it was only after the movie became famous that Burma renamed the river and gave it the name River Kwai. But that's really not the point. The point is this. The key takeaway from the movie is that it told us a lot about the Japanese enemy of World War II, how they viewed themselves and how they viewed their enemies. And if you weren't shocked by the way that the Japanese treated the POWs, then you must have been asleep during that movie. The sad fact is that the reality of the treatment of POWs by their Japanese captors was actually way worse than how it was portrayed in the movie, which was already pretty bad. 13,000, mostly British, but also Dutch, American POWs died and were buried along that railway that the Japanese were building. That was called the Burma-Thailand Railway, and also nearly 100,000 civilian slave laborers. Keep in mind, that railway was only 260 miles long. That turns out, if you do the math, to 435 murdered prisoners and slaves per mile, one every 12 feet. So that's how you should remember the miserable Japanese and their abhorrent behavior in World War II. Their legacy is the slaughter of POWs and locals. And let's not forget, beyond all this, there were incidents of cannibalism and other barbarities visited upon captured POWs and civilians alike. But we'll come back to all of this later. I just really want to set the mood for what's to come. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I've actually been to Japan more times than I can count. And I have many Japanese friends that I've been friendly with for years. When I'm talking with these people, I just cannot imagine that the people that I know had grandparents or parents who behaved as they did in World War II. It's really hard to understand. However, the problem is that I have the same thing going on with my German friends too. Exactly the same thought. I can't imagine how these extremely friendly people could behave so badly. You just can never tell. So let's, for the moment now, go back a bit and review exactly how we got ourselves into this particular mess. This story actually starts when Japan was trying to build up their military and achieve some success in the world. The effort to do so goes all the way back to the Meiji Empire. And we have to revisit the late 1800s and the grandfather to World War II's Emperor Hirohito. The Meiji Empire ushered in a period of major political, economic, and social change in Japan. Feudal Japan was coming to an end. Emperor Meiji, the guy on the left here, he ushered in this era of modernization, paving the way for Japan to become the major international power that it is today. In the 1890s, the emperor's approach was to go to both America and Britain and ask them to give them a proposal on how to modernize Japan and bring it into the 20th century. So there was a competition, and America lost that competition to Britain. The Japanese contracted with British shipyards and steel companies to build modern Japan with up-to-date technology, all from Britain. They built a state-of-the-art military, including a navy that used the leading-edge British ship designs, and this included the latest large-bore guns and, equally important, the naval aiming devices that got those weapons pointed in the right direction so that they could hit a target. These were particularly important for accurate fire, especially at night. And these guns were going to tear through America's early World War II Navy like a hot knife through butter. If you visit Japan today, I'm sure some of you have, this British influence is still front and center. Perhaps you noticed that cars in Japan are all right-hand drive. They drive on the same side of the street as the British, and now you know why. It dates back to this. So when World War I came, Japan immediately joined the alliance led by Britain, Japan, and Japan agreed to capture all of Germany's territories in the Pacific. Japan declared war on Germany on August 23rd of 1914 and against Austria-Hungary on the 25th of August 1914, just a few weeks after the war began. Thus, the Japanese were in it from the very start. America, on the other hand, only joined 3 years later. This slide here is talking about how after the British gave the Japanese the technology that they had, which formed their early navy, there was actually a major battle between the Japanese and the Russians. And the Russians were pummeled in a war in 1904 and 1905. Tsar Nicholas was forced to sign a peace treaty with the Japanese, and that treaty was ultimately signed in Portsmouth in Maine, and it was resided over by Theodore Roosevelt, who actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So the Japanese were an up-and-coming power. World War I came along. They joined the British, and what happened when the British joined forces with the Japanese is that the Japanese mission was to protect the sea lanes in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean from the Germans. They captured the German settlements on mainland China, centered around Tsingtao. And you can see here from the notes, you can read yourself. Germany was leasing this territories from the Chinese for years. This explains the origins, by the way, of Tsingtao beer. China's favorite brand is actually pretty good, and that's because it's actually German beer. That's where it came from. The Imperial Japanese Navy also seized Germany's colonies in the Pacific, which included the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Marshall Islands. So when World War I concluded and the four victorious powers met in Paris in 1919 to write what would become the Treaty of Versailles, Japan actually found itself left out and ignored. This did not go over well in Japan. Japan viewed themselves as being a world power at that time, and they didn't appreciate being treated like a second cousin. Turned out we were all going to regret this. And this was yet another very bad idea of Woodrow Wilson's that turned out to be a really bad idea. So after World War I, a series of naval agreements were drafted in the early 1920s. The four powers of France, Britain, the US, and Italy gave themselves the right to a vastly larger navy than everyone else, and their ally Japan was forced to agree to a very meager navy. Yet another slap in the face. But Japan had problems of her own. With no natural resources, they needed raw material for their economy, and so they had to figure out where to get it. They needed oil for all the cars that they were building, and the Navy needed oil because they were converting from coal to oil. Where to get it? And the world, as we all know, is not going to like the answer. Japan annexed Korea in 1910 for this very purpose, and then in 1931, they invaded Manchuria in China. Think along the lines of the Germans. This was the Japanese version of Lebensraum, or living space, Japanese style. And they set their sights on the Dutch East Indies, which is today what we call Indonesia, where a lot of oil at the time was being discovered. Japan's government came under the control of an increasingly aggressive and militaristic faction led by this man, Hideki Tojo. The West began to embargo Japan after the invasion of Manchuria, and the situation deteriorated from then onwards. While America struggled with the financial devastation of the Depression, much like Germany, the Japanese quietly began building and expanding their army and navy, quietly and in secret. And as we all know, this turned out to be a recipe for disaster. If we just take a look at the growth in the Japanese armed forces, we can see that starting in the 1930s, they only had a couple 100,000 men in the armed forces, and by 1945, they had 6 million men. But in 1931, they were about 10 years ahead of where America was in terms of our armed forces, and definitely in 1941, when they had 1.7 million in the armed forces, we had about 170,000. So they were way ahead of us. When the Japanese invaded China in 1931, the Chinese fought back with aid from Russia and even the US, even from Germany. But with the Chinese in full retreat, the Japanese set up a puppet government, and indeed an entire puppet state, which they called Manchukuo. The Japanese appeared unstoppable, scoring victory after victory, capturing Beijing, Shanghai, and then the Chinese capital of Nanjing in 1937. When they entered Nanjing, the Japanese troops, well, they ran amok, and it was a terrible disaster. And the world learned what would soon be called the Rape of Nanking, an Asian Holocaust that would eventually consume as many as 15 to 20 million Chinese civilians. In fact, the Sino-Japanese fight would grow to consume more than 4 million Chinese and Japanese military personnel. But 2/3 of the Japanese deaths would eventually come from disease and starvation. It wasn't going to end well. but this didn't stop at the time the Japanese from pummeling the Chinese for much of what became World War II. The Chinese central government eventually relocated to Chongqing in the Chinese interior, but by 1939, the Japanese were overextended, and the Chinese finally scored a large enough victory in the field that it stopped their advance, resulting in a stalemate. In November of 1939, Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek and supported by the U.S. launched a large-scale winter offensive, while in August 1940, Chinese communist forces under Mao Zedong, supported by the Russians, launched a counteroffensive in central China. The result left the Japanese with garrisons of large numbers of troops in the cities, while the Chinese rebels controlled this countryside, and they harassed the Japanese with hit-and-run tactics. During the fighting in 1939-1940, the U.S. added oil to the list of embargoed materials that could not be sold to the Japanese, and this was the final straw that put our two countries on a collision course. Now, at the time, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who you see here on the right, she was becoming a celebrity in the U.S., raising money before huge crowds of up to 30,000 people. And she only passed away actually quite recently, in 2003, which is fairly recent. Henry Luce, the senior editor and co-founder of Time magazine, was a huge fan of hers. And in 1937, she and her husband were Time magazine's Man and Wife of the Year. By 1943, she'd been on the cover of Time magazine 3 times. The result of all this was that the Chinese managed to stay in the war until British and American forces coming from India could begin to push the Japanese backwards. And this all started before Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. sent more than just money. We actually sent the Chinese an air force, which became known as the Flying Tigers. None other than President Roosevelt himself promised to deliver an air force to Madame Chiang directly. And over the strenuous objections of the military brass, Roosevelt did it anyway, and the entire episode became quite famous. The force was led by, if anyone knows, by a guy from Texas, Claire Lee Chennault, who retired from the U.S. Army Air Corps and headed for China in 1937, where he became the head of the Republic of China Air Force. In early 1941, these P-40 Warhawks that you see in the picture began arriving, and Chennault's volunteers, known as the First American Volunteer Group, became known as the Flying Tigers. Their planes were given this distinctive Chinese nationalist markings and even more distinctive nose art, which even after more than 80 years remains iconic to the Flying Tigers. But logistics problems in delivering gasoline, bombs, and shells for these planes kept them out of much actual combat until after Pearl Harbor. The first major combat took place 12 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Chennault's volunteers were pretty motivated, and results against the Japanese were exceptional. More importantly, the AVG's success was good news at a time when the war news in the rest of the Pacific and Europe was awful. They gave hope that America and her allies might eventually get the better hand and defeat Japan. AVG pilots with 180 planes destroyed at that time about 300 enemy aircraft, while losing only 14 pilots in combat. But just 7 months after Pearl Harbor in July of 1942, the AVG was disbanded, and it became the 23rd Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Corps, with Chennault now back in the U.S. Army Air Corps and taking over as commander. The group did retain the famous nose art in their 1940s, but Chennault spent the entire war fighting the Japanese in China. Now, anyone who sat through one of my seminars before knows that I often like to include bits of history with connections to other bits of history. Well, while the Chiangs were working their American contacts in the mid-30s to help against the Japanese, guess who was also helping the Chinese nationalists? It's quite a surprise. How about the Nazis? In the mid-1930s, the Nazis were trying to help the nationalists in exchange for raw materials. Some 80,000 of Chiang's soldiers were trained by the Germans, who sent this guy on the left, Alexander von Falkenhausen, as the head of the training effort. In 1938, when Chinese nationalists, or the Kuomintang, or KMT as it was called, when they lost Nanking and retreated to Wuhan, Hitler at that time, jump ship in favor of making an alliance with the Japanese. This agreement became known as the Anti-Comintern Pact. It was a secret protocol between Germany and Japan, and later also included Italy, that barred the agreeing parties from making political treaties with the Communist Internationale, or Comintern, as they called it. Basically, they're talking about the Russians. The Japanese then became Hitler's main anti-communist partner in Southeast Asia. Falkenhausen found himself out of a job, and he returned to Germany, where he became the military governor of Belgium during the war. Now, it turns out he was good friends with Karl Gordeler, and maybe you remember that name from the previous seminar on the German resistance to Hitler. Well, Gordeler was the mayor of Leipzig, who was executed after the July bomb plot against Hitler. And at the time, Falkenhausen was also accused of being involved in that bomb plot. He was thrown into Dachau and ended up at the end of the war on that bus that I talked about last year, filled with anti-Nazis that Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the SS, was trying to trade to the Allies in exchange for his life. So it's interesting to see that Falkenhausen started, or at least had a portion of his career in China. Now, when the Germans left China, it made room for the Russians to get involved in China. And the Russians' self-interest was to keep the Japanese too busy in China to even think about attacking into the Soviet Union from the east. So this would save Stalin the trouble of fighting a two-front war, he thought, if it ever ended up that he was going to have to fight Hitler. Now, I know this is starting to sound pretty complicated, right? Well, it was. So in 1937, the Russians and the Communist Chinese under Mao Zedong signed their own non-aggression pact. And the Russians sent the guy on the right, General Vasily Chuikov, as an advisor to Mao's forces. Chuikov would eventually become one of the main heroes of the Battle of Stalingrad, a seminar that I'm going to write for our next time together. But Chuikov figures centrally in the story of Stalingrad, but he also showed up in the fight in China fighting the Japanese. And he fought and won a very significant battle at a place called Khalkhin Gol, which is actually in Mongolia, giving the Japanese a severe mauling. And the battle ended in September of '39, just as Germany was invading Poland. The Japanese decided at that time never to take on the Russians again, and they eventually signed a neutrality pact with Stalin, which brings us to add further interesting details to this story. It turns out that probably the greatest spy and most important spy of World War II was this guy, Richard Sorge. He was a German who spied for the Russians and lived in Japan. And his information that he sent back to the Soviets let the Soviets know that the Japanese had no intention of invading Siberia, no matter what. And this allowed Stalin at the time to move an entire fully equipped army that was based in Siberia to Moscow in 1941. And that army that came from Siberia is the thing that helped Stalin stop the Nazis during that first year of the Russian invasion, probably making Sorge the most important spy of World War II. So, to summarize, with World War II about to start in 1939, we have the following all happening in China. The Nazis were partnered with the Chinese nationalists against the Japanese until they lost faith in China's ability to win. Hitler dumps this deal and the Chinese to make common cause with the Japanese. Stalin, feeling threatened by the Nazis and knowing that the Nazis' natural enemy is communism, decides after the Nazi-Japanese tie-up that he's going to make his own deal with the Chinese. So they stay in the fight because the Japanese, he wants them to keep the Japanese so busy that they cannot attack the Soviet rear. Then, just to add further complications, just as the war is about to start, as we all know, the entire arrangement is tossed into the air as Hitler signs his own non-aggression pact with Stalin. Wow, it's really complicated, and the poor Chinese were stuck in the middle. This new Soviet-Nazi pact lasted until June of 1941, when Hitler invaded Russia, and the Russian-Japanese neutrality pact lasted until the last few weeks of the war, and when Stalin broke the pact and invaded Japan through China, and also invaded the Kuril Islands and Northern Korea. And of course, as we know, the Russians have never given back the Kuril Islands to Japan, despite the passage of roughly 80 years since the end of World War II. The Soviet pact with Mao lasted through the war, but the Russians had very little to give to their Chinese allies, as they had their hands full with fighting the Nazis, other than moral support. Anyhow, now that this is all perfectly clear in your minds, we just have to keep going. So as mentioned, in the late 1930s, the US had embargoed oil and steel sales to Japan. To the Japanese, the solution to this lay in the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, or Malaysia as it's called now, where there was both oil and steel. Now, any intelligence service would have been able to figure this out. Only one small problem. Too bad, we really didn't have one, at least not one that worked very well. Roosevelt didn't really trust anyone with sensitive information other than himself, and he saw to it that there was very little investment in military intelligence before the war started, which brings us to what Roosevelt's plan was. Instead, Roosevelt thought it would be a really good plan to send his good buddy, Vincent Astor, to take his personal yacht and head to the South Pacific in early 1941 to see what the Japanese were up to and to report back directly to himself, not to the army, but just directly to himself. The New York tycoon, Astor, whose actual father died on the Titanic, took along James Roosevelt. James Roosevelt was Teddy's oldest son, and they both went on a 4-month cruise/spying mission to the Marshall Islands, trying to spot Japanese fortifications. Not exactly the sort of intelligence service that we desperately needed. Now, this is not to say that they didn't try, and it's not to say that we didn't have some efforts. This is just to give you an idea of how Roosevelt was thinking. We did, on the other hand, have a very successful effort to decrypt Japanese signals. In the years between the world wars, the US Army and the Navy had separate but very small code-breaking and cryptology departments. The US Army called theirs the Signal Intelligence Service, and it operated from 1927 to 1942. The Friedmans were in charge of this service. William Friedman, on the left here, was in charge of the SIS during this entire time. His wife, Elizabeth Friedman, that you see on the right here, was also a brilliant cryptographer and also worked for the SIS. They were hampered in their efforts by just having a staff of only 22 people, 16 of them officers, and this didn't change until December the 7th, 1941. Scarce resources kept them in a near constant battle with the Navy's cryptology group over funding. Now, the Navy, on the other hand, when not engaged in fighting a foreign enemy, spent the interwar years involved in the funding war with the Army. And the Navy maintained their own separate decryption effort called OP-20G, or in Navy terms, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, 20th Division, Section G. And the Army's William Friedman coined the term cryptoanalysis. He, along with another cryptographer, Leo Rosen, they built this machine that you see here on the right, and it was designed to crack the Japanese diplomatic code. The decrypts were called purple, as they kept the messages filled in purple binders. That's where that code name came from. The code name for these decrypted messages was magic, and the US was able to decrypt Japanese diplomatic messages throughout the entire war without the Japanese catching on. They also had success building a machine to crack the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, but this effort used a IBM punch card machine to work out the possible solutions. The Army, the Navy, and the Coast Guard, the FBI, and even the FCC all had their own radio intercept operations, and it was more than just a little cumbersome. If it weren't so serious, the rivalry would almost have been comical. At one point, the Navy demanded that the Army forbid civilians to touch their cipher equipment, which they actually had received from the Army, and this despite the fact that the equipment had been designed and built by Friedman and Rosen, who were actually civilians. So it just made no sense. They even argued about who should deliver information to the White House. At one point, the White House tried to appease the squabbling by having the Army handle the magic intercepts on even-numbered days, while the Navy handled the magic intercepts on odd-numbered days. That sounds clever, right? Then, after further infighting, They further agreed in January of 1941 that the Army would bring magic messages to the White House in January, in March, in May, in July, September, and November, while the Navy would handle February, April, June, August, October, and December. But this soon also dissolved in acrimony when in May, a month in which the Army was in charge, they found a magic message on the top of FDR's military aide's desk, a guy by the name of Pa Watson. So this was a security breach. Out went the Army altogether, and the Navy became responsible for delivering messages to the White House. For the Army, the consolation prize was to deliver magic messages to the State Department. Now, given what I've just explained to you, can it be any surprise to anyone that the decrypts of the Japanese intentions of December the 7th, 1941 were going a little bit unnoticed? The lack of a single intelligence agency meant that much of the magic information was delayed or unused, and it was kind of a mess. By December of 41, as we know, World War II in Europe was already in full steam. Western Europe was overrun. The Germans were at the English Channel. The Battle of the Atlantic was raging, and Enigma was having its impact. But the major thing that was happening at that moment, in June of 1941, the Nazis invaded Russia with 3 armies. In the north, they surrounded Leningrad, and they'd lay siege to Leningrad for 1,000 days. In Army Group Center, under Field Marshal von Bock, reached the outskirts of Moscow that first year. Spent and tired, they never made it into the city. And in the south, von Rundstedt headed towards Kiev and the Caucasus. It was not looking good. At the same time, back in the Pacific by 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had 10 fleet-sized aircraft carriers, all superior in design to US carriers in service at the time. The Japanese had 14 battleships, fewer than the US, but the Japanese battleships were all fairly modern, while the US fleet was on average nearly 25 years old, with many in service since Teddy Roosevelt built them in the early 1900s. The Japanese leadership knew that their tiny country could not outproduce America over a long war. They needed a mighty knockout blow that would hopefully force America to quickly sue for peace and get them to the negotiation table. So this brings us to the plan that was devised by this man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, to come up with a good plan to get the Japanese into a leadership position against the Americans. Yamamoto began planning in the spring of 41. The Japanese learned much from a British air attack on the Italian fleet at a naval base in Taranto in 1940. That's Taranto in Italy, not Toronto in Canada. Especially the need to modify their airdrop torpedoes so as to allow them to run very shallow. Why is that important? Because Pearl Harbor was just as shallow as Taranto. The Japanese set out on their mission on November the 26th, 1941, with 6 aircraft carriers, 400 planes to take up a position northwest of Hawaii. 360 planes would attack in 2 waves of 180, leaving 40 more to fly above the fleet and protect the fleet. They arrived at their launch point on Sunday morning, December the 7th, and here's what they showed up with. They came with 6 carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shikaku, and the Zuikaku. They showed up with 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and you can see the rest of the list here, including 5 midget submarines and those 400 planes. To defend, the U.S. had 8 battleships, the California, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Tennessee, Nevada, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. There were 8 cruisers and 30 destroyers, 4 submarines, and about 390 aircraft. The first wave of Japanese planes arrived just before 8 a.m. The second wave arrived 1 hour later. The first wave was going to be the primary attack. The second was supposed to go after the targets that were missed by the first wave. Their orders were to first go after the U.S. carriers, then the cruisers, then the battleships as the third target. Of course, not everything goes right, and not everything went right for the Japanese. A reconnaissance float plane that was to be launched from a submarine that surfaced some 700 miles from Hawaii at a place called French Frigate Shoals, west of Hawaii, found a U.S. frigate in the area, so they could not launch the seaplane. As a result, Yamamoto did not know that the U.S. carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor. Now, luck is important in war. A bit of luck for us, a bit of bad luck for them. As the first wave approached Oahu, a rudimentary radar station at Opana Point picked up the incoming planes. The duty officer that morning at the operations center, a guy by the name of Kermit Tyler, presumed that the huge target growing on the screen on the radar was actually an expected flight of 6 B-17s. No alert was issued. As the planes began to swoop in over the island, phones began to ring and radios began to chatter. All for naught. Too late. Men aboard U.S. ships awoke to the sounds of alarms, bombs and torpedoes exploding all around them. The general quarters klaxons began on a dozen ships all at once. The U.S. mainland would soon hear the famous radio message sent in the clear. And here's a telegram that shows that message. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. Break. This is no drill. And it really wasn't. The Japanese air attack began at 7:48 local time. That's about 2 p.m. Washington time. The slower torpedo bombers, I guess that would make it 1 p.m. Texas time if we had daylight saving. I don't know if we had the same time zones in those days, but it was 2 p.m. in Washington. The slower torpedo bombers went after the battleships. The dive bombers attacked air bases all over Oahu, including Hickam and Wheeler, the two largest. The planes in the second wave would go on to attack the Army Air Corps' Bellows Field near Kaneohe on the windward side of the island, and also Ford Island, which is where all the battleships were parked. Only a few of our planes managed to rise up in opposition. Now, probably every American has seen these photos of the devastation. This is a photo of the Arizona at the moment of when it exploded from its magazines, and this is a very iconic picture showing what the battleship row looked like at the time of the attack. You see here the Nevada, the Arizona, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, the California, the Tennessee, which is inboard of the West Virginia, and the Maryland, which is inboard of the Oklahoma. The Pennsylvania was actually across the harbor here in the dry dock, which is here. This is the Pennsylvania that you see right here. And the tank farms, which the Japanese famously failed to come back to blow up, you can see them right over here. This is where the tank farms were located. The planes in the second wave attacked the Bellows Field, and what we've seen is that the damage at Bellows Field was so bad that no planes were able to rise up from Bellows Field. But that didn't stop individuals from taking action. Key among those was Dory Miller from Waco, who was serving as a cook on the West Virginia. Making his way to the deck, Miller first tried to help a badly wounded Mervyn Benyon, who was the captain of the West Virginia, but Benyon refused to leave his post, at which point Miller found himself standing next to a deck-mounted dual 50 caliber Browning machine gun. Ammo for the gun began arriving, and Miller, who'd actually never fired the gun, was told to figure it out and fire away at the attacking Japanese. The West Virginia continued to be hammered by 1,800-pound bombs and several torpedoes, but these ships were unbelievably tough. They didn't go down easy, and the West Virginia was expertly counter-flooded so that she would not capsize. Instead, the ship settled onto the seabed to be salvaged and to return to service later in the war. For his efforts that day, Dory Miller was awarded the Navy Cross by Chester Nimitz aboard the USS Enterprise 6 months later at a ceremony in May of 1942. The war in the Pacific was not getting off to a very good start, and the results were absolutely devastating. If we look at what the results were, we can see on the US side 4 battleships sunk, 4 battleships damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 other ships sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,335 people killed, and another 1,100 wounded. On the Japanese side, the results were almost the mirror image. Only 4 midget subs lost, 1 midget sub grounded, 29 planes destroyed, 70 damaged, only 64 killed, and 1 sailor captured. For the Arizona, which was serving as Admiral Kidd's flagship, it was hit by 4 armor-piercing bombs. It exploded, as we all know. Total loss, 1,177 killed. The Oklahoma, hit by 5 torpedoes. Actually, it capsized. Total loss, 429 dead. She was eventually salvaged with a Herculean effort, but she never returned to service. A video of her being righted with enormous booms and counterweights can be found on the internet. Quite an amazing engineering feat to turn that thing back over. The West Virginia, hit by 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes, was sunk. She would be returned to service in July of 44, but at the time suffered 106 dead. The California, hit by 2 bombs, 2 torpedoes, 100 dead. The Nevada, 60 dead. The Pennsylvania was damaged, etc., etc. The Tennessee, hit by 2 bombs, 5 dead. The list goes on and on. On the Japanese side, something very interesting happened that was going to be very instructive about the war. You saw on that list that the Japanese brought with them 5 of these 2-man midget submarines, each that carried 2 torpedoes. One of these actual subs is on display in Fredericksburg at the World War II Museum, dedicated to the war in the Pacific. These 5 subs were dropped off of 5 larger subs the morning of the attack. They were supposed to sneak into the harbor and fire their torpedoes at various targets. Several of them were spotted, however, outside the mouth of the harbor, and the first shots of the war were actually fired by a U.S. destroyer, the Ward, which sank one of these ships, one of these subs, and another was hit by the USS Monaghan. But one of the subs lost buoyancy and washed up on shore. That's the one that's in Fredericksburg. One of the 2 occupants became the first POW of the war. Now, to be noted here on this picture on the left, in the lower left, you'll see the pictures of the 9 Japanese sailors who perished in those 2-man subs. The one sailor who was taken POW by us, he was viewed and reviled in Japan for having been taken captive. And this idea that POWs should fight to the death rather than be taken prisoner was just going to be a terrible sign of things to come. As a result of the slow decryption and translation at the Japanese embassy, the Japanese declaration of war was not delivered in a timely fashion, so the attack was forever viewed as a sneak attack by the Japanese, and what they managed to accomplish in 15 minutes is something that might otherwise have never happened. This idea that it was viewed as a sneak attack completely united Americans under one banner: avenge Pearl Harbor, and it screamed out from every farm, every city, and every hilltop, from coast to coast. Whatever the country was thinking about isolationism before, that was done. The effort was now total war, no matter the cost. Now, Yamamoto, who studied in America and traveled extensively across the country, he was not very happy that this had happened. He was hoping that the declaration of war would arrive on time, but in fact it arrived late, and that America would view this as a sneak attack. He's thought to have uttered this phrase, "I fear all I have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible rage." Now, this unfortunately is not totally historically correct. We know from his staff that Yamamoto was sulking and not participating in the celebrations after the attack. He was not upset about the attack, he was upset about the message being delivered late and the idea that the American public would be enraged. The screenwriter from the movie, Tora Tora Tora, made up that famous quote. Nonetheless, avenging Pearl Harbor would take almost 4 years. Yamamoto himself would unceremoniously be shot out of the sky some 15 months later in April of 1943 by American Lockheed P-38 fighters. That plane, by the way, was not even in service when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. If there was a silver lining to the attack, it was the Japanese decided to leave the area before they launched a 3rd wave. The 3rd wave would almost assuredly have attacked those dry docks, the oil tank farm, and more than a year's supply of fuel. The submarine base might have been hit, or the Navy Command Center. All of these things would have set us back badly in the war. In fact, if we'd have lost the oil supply, the whole Pacific Fleet would have had to move back to the West Coast. But America's troubles were far from over. Just 5 hours after Yamamoto's task force bombed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also attacked the northern Philippine island of Luzon. And this is where we're going to pick up our story next week. So we're going to end today's lecture with there. We're going to stop right here with the sound of the general quarters klaxon ringing in your ears, preparing yourself for the beating that we're about to take at the hands of the Japanese next week. So between now and then, you got to get plenty of rest. And I'll open it up to any questions.
Okay, we have a question from Lance. He says, I noticed that Richard Sorge died in November 1944. Was he outed and executed?
Yes, he was held prisoner for, I think, 18 months or more, and then he was ultimately executed by the Japanese. I visited his grave in a cemetery in Tokyo, and actually it's still maintained. It's not clear who's maintaining it, but somebody is maintaining his grave and bringing fresh flowers. Of course, I was there probably in, I don't know, 2006 or 2007, but we can assume somebody is probably still maintaining it, but he's buried in Tokyo.
Okay, we have another question. What is the difference between a battleship, a destroyer, a cruiser, etc.?
So it's all about size. Battleships are the largest ships in the fleet. Cruisers are slightly smaller than them, and destroyers are usually quite small. Destroyer, of course, it's not a simple question to answer, because what happens with all Navy ships, like everything the government builds, you build one, and then when you go to build the next one, you say, gee, I wish it had this and that. And so there's a creep that occurs with many of these designs. They try to build them all the same, but over time, the weights and sizes of these ships was all being extended. So battleships got bigger, cruisers got bigger, and started growing towards the size of a small battleship. Basically, it has to do with the size of the ship, the number of guns, and the bore and size of those guns. So battleships generally have 16 or 18-inch guns. Cruisers will generally have 10 or 12-inch guns, and destroyers may only have 4 or 6-inch guns. But they generally, over a period of time, are all trying to get more and more armament on them and go faster, carry more men, and be able and carry more weapons so that they can do more damage. And that was sort of what happened during World War II with all the different sizes of ships. So when we went to build the USS Missouri, this huge battleship that the surrender ceremony was signed on, it was actually much bigger than any of these battleships that you saw today.
Another question from Mike. Why did the Japanese forgo the third wave attack? Did they fear some sort of counterattack?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the Japanese, we're going to learn in the coming weeks that the Japanese had a tendency to favor preservation of their power rather than favor making bold strikes to knock the enemy out. So there were many instances during the war when an American commander would have attacked, but the corresponding Japanese commander lost their nerve because they didn't want to risk losing their ship. So in many instances, the threat of retaliation or a counterattack had the Japanese, what we would say, prematurely withdrawing when they had a significant advantage. Of course, it's easy to say this after the fact because you don't really know what's lurking out there over the horizon. But the Japanese left the area thinking that they should leave while they still could. They had basically suffered no casualties. They got totally away with it. They were worried that those American carriers might show up and attack them, which of course would have changed the outcome of the Pearl Harbor attack. So they decided, Nagumo, the admiral in charge, decided to beat a hasty retreat. Yamamoto was not happy about that either, but there was not much he could say about it since the attack was actually viewed, obviously, by the Japanese as a huge success given the results. But we're going to see in the future weeks, this is going to come up again and again where the Japanese have an advantage, but they don't prosecute that advantage in a way that would have really helped them, but instead move quickly to preserve their strength, worried that they might lose whatever victory they have in a counterattack. And so this happened numerous times, which, as I said, we will discuss again.
David asks, what ship tried to make it out of Pearl Harbor and was told to run aground?
Oh, that is a good question. That is a good question. I would have to look that up. Good question. I'll answer that next week. I should know that, but I can't think of the name of it at this time. It's one of the battleships, I think, was actually one of the ones that ran aground, but I don't know. I'll let you know next week.
Betty asks, when was the first aircraft carrier launched?
So in the United States, our first carrier was launched actually even before World War I, the Langley. I'm not sure the exact year, but the Langley, and we're going to talk about this a little bit next week as well. The Langley was our first carrier. They were flying biplanes off the Langley. In fact, the British flew biplanes off of their aircraft carriers through much of the war until America gave them the planes to go to regular non-biplane planes. When the British sank the Bismarck, a famous story from World War II, they were flying biplanes off of one of their aircraft carriers. So naval aviation dated back to the early 1910s, even slightly before that. The Langley was the first carrier. These were rather sad and efforts on our part. Our Navy was really struggling with modernization. The battleship was their key strategy. And if anyone remembers back to last spring, we happen to remember that the Army's slogan or motto all the way up until World War II was, in fact, the horse always gets through. Well, the Navy's idea was that the battleship would be the primary surface ship of any future war. And of course, the aircraft carrier and naval aviation proved them woefully wrong, as we all know. But they, at the time, were fighting amongst themselves inside the Navy about naval aviation and aircraft carriers versus battleships. We're going to very specifically talk about this next week. But this fight carried through much of the 20s and into the 30s, and really only got resolved. Frankly, it really only got resolved at Pearl Harbor, when, of course, our battleships proved that enemy aircraft could sink them with some relative ease, and we realized that this was going to be a thing. So we really started a crash course. Actually, we had kind of figured that out beforehand, but our crash building program really picked up steam after Pearl Harbor, when there was nobody left at the Pentagon advocating battleships were going to be predominant after Pearl Harbor.
Jim wants to know, how did Japan get the materials and funds to build their armed services in the 1930s?
Well, they had invaded China, and of course, the story of the invasion of China is one of a massive economic raping and pillaging. So they were taking everything they could from the Koreas, where they had invaded in the 1910s, and then again in China, stealing everything they could lay their hands on, including, of course, raw materials, steel, etc. So they were definitely taking advantage of the fact that these places had no way to defend themselves, and they were all exporting everything they could, including food. Let's not forget food, back to Japan. And of course, this was causing starvation problems on some of these islands, and eventually did cause all kinds of problems.
Stephen asks, what is your perspective on FDR actually knowing an attack would happen?
Well, I've heard this many times. People have written about this. I don't think there's any actual evidence that he knew about the attack ahead of time. I think that would take a lot of guts to know about it and let it happen, given the fact that if they'd have bombed those oil tanks, our entire Navy would have had to withdraw from Pearl Harbor and go back to the West Coast So we would have been starting the World War II from a situation where Japan would be attacking our west coast. I'm not sure any president, no matter how cavalier about it, would sign up for something like that. I know he wanted to unify the country. I know he was having trouble doing so, but this seems like a bridge too far to think that he would have known about it. I've heard the same thing, that Churchill also knew about it, but again, I don't know if there's any real evidence of that. Now, on the other hand, if we had a proper intelligence service, we might have had some clue that they were coming. And as we're going to talk next week, even though the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, our commanders in the Philippines managed to do absolutely nothing for 48 hours after Pearl Harbor to protect themselves, so that when the Japanese attacked the Philippines, our armed forces there were also caught completely flat-footed, and no real attempt to rise up with all the airplanes we had in the Philippines ever occurred, because they got blasted on the ground. We're going to talk about that next week. So if you have complaints about Roosevelt, the one you really ought to be asking about is our good friend Douglas MacArthur. We'll talk about that next week.
Jim asks, where were the U.S. aircraft carriers near Pearl Harbor? Where were they near Pearl Harbor on December 7th?
So the week before December the 7th, they had set out with a load of planes to carry the planes to Wake Island. These pre-World War II planes, they couldn't fly all the way across the Pacific, of course, because it was huge. They had to be carried. So the carriers had left Pearl Harbor about a week before and made their way to Wake Island, where they dropped off a load of planes. They stopped at Midway to drop off some supplies, and they were making their way back to Pearl Harbor. They were only about 24 hours out on December the 7th when the attack happened, and actually they arrived in port on December the 8th. But of course, by then the Japanese were long gone. In fact, Halsey wanted to turn and head off and try and chase down the Japanese. That probably would not have been a very good idea, given the condition of his ships, the fact that he had very few escorts with him, and the fact that the Japanese were there with 6 aircraft carriers. That probably turned out to be not a very good idea. But cooler heads prevailed, and he just returned to port on the 8th of December.
We have just about a minute or two left, and we still have questions coming in. Perhaps we can save them for next week. Would that work for you?
Well, if you want to keep going, we can. Of course, next week we're going to end up with more questions, so I don't know if we'll have time, but whatever you want to do. We can. I'm not obligated to go anywhere, so I can stay if y'all want, or it's up to y'all.
Is that all right with you, Jerry? I don't know if she's there yet. Okay,
I am here. We need to stop at 3:40 or 3:41, so we can go a minute or two over.
Okay.
Question from Steve I've been saving. During the 6 weeks of this seminar, please consider addressing 2 topics. 1, was Japan close to developing its own atomic bomb, and if so, how close, as argued by Richard Wilcox? Number 2, please explain some of Japan's thinking for rebuffing Hitler's request that Japan open a front against the Soviet Union in 39 to 40 instead of focusing on the Southern Pacific to try to eject the UK from Southeast Asia. So
sure,
Japan,
I'll do that. I'll take a note about that. Absolutely. In fact, I have a very good slide that I got from Los Alamos. I'm working on a project with Los Alamos right now for my day job, and the guy sent me a PowerPoint presentation that talks about what Japan was actually doing during World War II in terms of enriching uranium. So your question is extremely timely, and I'll make sure to cut that PowerPoint slide out and show it.
we have another minute. Mary says, I'm reading a book called The Code Girls about the Freedmans and the growth of the organization. Oh, I just lost it. Oh, I just lost, here it is. Um,
I can see it.
and the growth and organization of the American intelligence effort. The premise of the book was that the tremendous impact that women had, unthought before then.
If you saw my seminar on cracking Enigma, you saw what a huge role women had in code breaking in Washington and also in Dayton with the Enigma machines that the bombs that were being built by NCR. We saw that in the seminar in the spring. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of women in intelligence gathering next week when we talk about Rochefort and some of the other things that were going on in the Pacific. So that's going to come up next week too.
Is it true that Japanese attacked while they attacked? Is it true that the Japanese attacked Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, and an airstrike of Sydney at the same time as Pearl Harbor?
The attack, no. So first it was Pearl Harbor, then it was the Philippines, then Indonesia, then they went after Malaysia. They landed in Malaysia a couple days later. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day that year. So Pearl Harbor was December the 7th. On Christmas Day, Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. I'm going to show you my mother has a cousin, or had a cousin, who died there, and that's going to be part of next week's seminar.
Okay, let me see. How many troops did America have at the close of the war?
12 million Americans were in the armed forces at the end of the war. 12 million.
Was the embargo against Japan of oil and steel a good idea or a bad idea? Paul asks.
Well, so the Japanese were misbehaving in China. We wanted to get them to stop. The only tools that we had were the idea of embargoing oil and steel. We did that, but like everything in life, there's sometimes unintended consequences. And instead of the Japanese backing down, they doubled down. And when they doubled down, that's when they decided to attack Pearl Harbor and start the war. So, you know, this is the calculus that our elected officials have to go through when they decide whether or not they want to put sanctions on somebody. It's what the other side's going to do. And, you know, really clever politicians try to think ahead and game out the actions of the other side before you take that action. Of course, you know, you don't get it right every time. So hard to say if it was a good idea or not. If you were a Chinese person under the thumb of the Japanese in at that time, you probably would have been very happy that America took a stand. If you were someone sitting in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December the 7th, you probably were having second thoughts. So I guess it just depends.
I think we might have 5 more minutes because we go till 3:50. Question, where were subs and why didn't they attack, and how far away were our subs and aircraft carriers, and why didn't they get the word to attack?
Yeah, so as I said with the carriers, they were about a day out of Pearl Harbor. Halsey wanted to go after the Japanese, but he was overruled and told just to come back. Probably a good thing, as I said, that he didn't, because we were totally overmatched, and it would have been a very, very, very bad day if we'd have lost the 3 carriers that he had with him, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, or the Hornet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Yorktown. It would have been a very, very bad day if we'd have lost those carriers the day after Pearl Harbor. The submarines are a very good question. So at the time, you got to remember, our armed forces are at the end of World War II, did not look anything like the armed forces at the start of World War II. We only had a few subs. we had a sub base in Pearl Harbor, but we only had about 20 functional subs. Several of them were in port. Most of them were out at sea on maneuvers, training, whatever. And none of them were anywhere near where the Japanese launched from, or they certainly never came across them, because there's no recordings of them ever having a sighting of a Japanese task force. So they were out of position. What else did you ask me? It was the subs, the carriers, and is there another part to that?
How did they get word, or why didn't they get word of the attack?
Oh, well, they specifically did get word, and as I said, Halsey was told to return to base and not risk the ships. So they did receive radio messages to not chase after the Japanese. I don't know about the subs. That I don't know about, but the carriers were definitely told to forget it, come back.
Michael wants to know, can you relate the Russia-China alliance during World War II to their alliance during the Cold War? I always wondered if Russia and the US would have gone to war during the Cold War, would China have waited to side with whichever country was winning?
Well, wow. That's a good question. I'm probably no better able to answer that than you are about what China would have done during the Cold War. I can tell you that the Stalin had an agreement with Mao. However, he wasn't able to deliver very much support because Russia had their hands full with the Nazis. So he wasn't able to deliver a lot of supplies to Mao. But of course, intellectually and politically, they were totally aligned in terms of their politics. And your guess is as good as mine how that would have carried over in the Cold War if the U.S. had ever gone after Russia. China may have decided just to see who wins and pick up the pieces, but who knows? I don't know how to answer that. Sorry.
Clyde asks, did the U.S. have any spies embedded in Japan prior to the Pearl Harbor attack? If not, why not? And was Japan considered a threat to the U.S. at that time?
I know of no stories or books that I can think of U.S. spies in Japan before the war. There are a few little stories. There's the story of the pitcher Mo Berg, who claims that he went to Japan prior to the war, taking pictures for the American intelligence. But it's not clear to me that that's not made up. I cannot think of. There are no books that I've read. I guess that's the best way I can answer that. I know of no such thing. And given what I told you about Roosevelt's intelligence efforts, I would say that we probably were pretty blind in terms of. I don't know who would have sent them because military intelligence at that point was really quite non-functional. There may have been one or two. I don't know, but I would have to go dig through and see what I can find. But I suspect not.
Harry says, the effort to rearm and gain military superiority in such a short time is amazing. Can you talk about how we were able to accomplish that?
Well, sure. Of course, this is the story of Rosie the Riveter. After Pearl Harbor, the entire economy converted literally overnight. There was not a single civilian car built in Detroit for the entire duration of the war. Every shipyard was immediately given contracts to build ships. The military started inducting people who were volunteering at a pace that they could barely keep up with because Americans were so angry about the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was the thing that unified us. It was a Herculean effort that was primarily a result of the fact that America at the time had a huge amount of industrial capacity, certainly compared to the rest of the world. We had huge steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Of course, they're all gone now, but this was the Rust Belt was in full bore at that time. You'd go to Philadelphia, and there was a huge number of tooling shops making tools for absolutely every possible thing you could imagine. This was a huge activity based in Pennsylvania. Most of this is also all gone, but our economy then doesn't look anything like it does now. We were the manufacturing base of the world at that time. And, you know, every single factory stopped building whatever they were making and started building guns, bombs, ships, planes. The craziest companies got involved in building the craziest thing. Anything they thought they could build, they would eventually get a contract from the military to build. And this completely caused us to go into a mode where once we got that going, we had so much material pouring off the assembly lines that it was staggering. And of course, most wars become wars of attrition, and America, with all this industrial capacity and a population that was pretty large and an industrial base that wasn't being bombed every night because, you know, no one has a bomber that could reach America. This allowed us to just produce an endless amount of goods, not only for ourselves, but all of our allies, including the Russians. You know, we became the country that armed everybody, the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt said. He wasn't kidding. So it took a year, however, you know, and we're going to talk about that next week. The process of building all those factories, training all those men, making all those weapons would take us the better part of 1943. And it was during 1943, which is the time when 1942. 1942 became this year that it took us to build all this stuff. And it was during that year that we were at our greatest peril, because this was the time when the Japanese were at their highest strength and we were at our weakest. And if there was ever a time when we were going to lose this war or be forced to come to some sort of peace terms, it was during 1942. But as you'll see from next week, by the end of 1942 and into 1943, all this new production started showing up. The tide had changed, but I don't want to destroy my three-pronged seminar series by giving it all away, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Richard Brooke. And we think that the World War II 6 Easy Lessons in Europe is still available on the campsite. We'll try to confirm that. And also people are wanting to know your URL, your website address, and also they want to see your picture next time. And thank you so much, Richard, for your generosity. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Talk with you all next week. I'm looking forward to it. Have a nice week, everybody. Get plenty of rest. We're going to take a shellacking next week.
Your website is what?
The Richard M. Brooke, BROOK.com. And there's a YouTube channel that you can go to watch these videos at. That's on YouTube. If you just search for my name on YouTube, they'll come right up. Richard Brooke, they'll come up. World War II, it'll come right up. So you can find the lectures from the spring are all loaded there, as well as on the OLLI website, plus some other stuff that I've done. But the other seminars that I've done and articles that I've written are all at richardmbrooke.com, which is a blog that I maintain. And this is where I will post the reading list as well.
Thank you so much. See you all next week at 2:40 on Thursday.